and welcome to our Election 2020 project program. This evening, the topic is America's Place in the World, and we are pleased to present a distinguished panel to talk about that topic. The Election 2020 program is part of the Tennessee World Affairs Council work with Belmont University, which is serving as host to the October 22nd presidential debate. And please join us on that evening for a debate watch party. And then the following week on the 29th, we'll return with the second part of this America's Place in the World series with a program with Ambassador Thomas Pickering and Ambassador John Kornblum. But this evening we have a very distinguished panel to talk about those topics. Joining me this evening to conduct our roundtable is Professor Thomas-Schwartz, distinguished professor of history from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Schwartz is a professor of history of U.S. foreign relations of the United States with related interest in American politics, the history of international relations, and modern European history. You can find more of his biographical information on our website and the Eventbrite page, but let me add that he recently published a book, Henry Kissinger and American Power, a Political Biography. The book has received considerable attention in prominent book reviews, and you can see the interview that Professor Schwartz and I did about a month ago about the book on our youtube.com/TNWAC website. So with me this evening, Professor Schwartz, thank you for chairing our session tonight. Good to see you, Tom.
Well, it's good to see you, Pat, and I'm glad to welcome and very honored to be here and be able to chair this panel.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this. Up till now, we've had in our Election 2020 series a number of panels with distinguished guests talking about great power conflict, this or that country, global issues like climate change, trade, globalization. But tonight we're going to focus on where America fits in the world and what we have to look forward to as we could possibly be transforming U.S. foreign policy in the years to come. With us this evening, we are very pleased to welcome General John Allen and Dr. Jessica Matthews. General John Allen assumed the presidency of the Brookings Institution in November 2017, having most recently served as chair of security and strategy and a distinguished fellow in the foreign policy program at Brookings. General Allen is a retired U.S. Marine 4-star, former commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. He is the co-author of the book Turning Point, Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence, alongside co-author Darrell West. General Allen served in 2 senior diplomatic roles following his retirement from the Marine Corps. First, for 15 months as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Middle East security, during which he led the security dialogue for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. President Barack Obama then appointed General Allen as special presidential envoy to the Global Coalition to counter ISIL, or ISIS, a position he held for 15 months. General Allen's diplomatic efforts grew the coalition to 65 members, effectively halting the expansion of ISIL. Up first with Dr. Schwartz will be Dr. Jessica Tuchman Matthews. She is a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She served as Carnegie's president for 18 years. Before her appointment, Dr. Tuchman's career included posts in Dr. Matthews, in both the executive and legislative branches of government, in management and research in the nonprofit arena, and in journalism and science policy. She was director of the Council on Foreign Relations Washington program and a senior fellow. While there, she published her seminal 1997 Foreign Affairs article, Power Shift, chosen by the editors as one of the most influential in the journal's 75 years. So those are our guests tonight. We're thankful that they're joining us to talk about this important topic. And now I'll turn it over to Professor Tom Schwartz.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks very much to the Tennessee World Affairs Council and its partner for organizing this Election 2020 project, and in particular, these two panels on America's place in the world. Dr. Matthews, I'd like to start with you tonight and ask you if you'd like to present some ideas and concepts to frame this discussion of America's place in the world and set our discussion off.
Well, Tom, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. It sounds it's a wonderful program and a great organization. I think the moment that we're at, obviously an enormously important one for all the reasons that any sentient American knows, but is also, although foreign policy is almost invisible in this campaign, is an incredibly important moment in foreign policy as well, because the strategy and bipartisan policy that guided the US basically from the end of World War II until a few years ago has run out of steam. And that policy was that we would lead what we then called the free world geopolitically and through economic largesse, and through a vibrant network of allies and alliances and international organizations that we had done a great deal to found and to support. And that in addition to our own national interests, we would try worldwide to promote democracy, human rights, free trade, capitalism. It was a very ambitious strategy, and rightly so, because at the end of World War II, when it was formulated, we were vastly the dominant power. And then several things happened. One, we lost the motivating factor of the Soviet enemy when the Cold War ended. And that made a huge difference in how Americans felt. And then in the ensuing years, we had this rocketing explosion of Chinese economic success which left us now confronted with something we have never confronted before, which is a geopolitical great power that is also an economic powerhouse. The Soviet Union was never that. So we have a brand new rival in Asia that we didn't have before. Globalization dramatically changed the distribution of economic inequality in our country and had a huge effect on our manufacturing jobs and therefore on the stability of the middle class. And we also had the growth of populism, not just here, but worldwide. So you put all those factors together and they gave us a completely transformed world. And, in my view, Trump's America Firstism, he didn't so much invent it as he perceived it and grabbed it and exploited it. But it was the grievances, the sense of change, the sense that things were different now was there. It was a pre-existing condition, so to speak, before he began his campaign. But his particular genius is to be able to sense what major parts of the American polity are feeling. So to wrap up what I'm trying to say, I think that we have that set of ideas and strategies and assumptions that have guided our foreign policy from both parties for 70 years in this last 4 years clearly run out of steam. One way you can tell, and this is a shocking but true fact, is that the United States Senate has been unable to ratify a single multilateral treaty in 25 years, and a quarter of a century. And so the next president, not if it's Trump, because he won't do that, but if it's Biden, the next president is going to have to rethink, which is the hardest thing there is to do, to come up, I think, with a new strategy that fits our current resources, our political will, and our influence, all of which are dramatically changed from what we're used to, what we've grown up with, what we've practiced for all these decades. So it's an enormously important moment, even though we're not talking about foreign policy in the campaign at all.
Oh, that's a wonderful way to get us started. You've laid out an agenda. I have some questions, but let me go to General Allen and ask, first off, if there's anything in what Dr. Matthews said that you'd like to specifically comment, but then if not, I do want to ask you the first question on our list, which is, of course, to address the U.S. relationship with China, and ask you if you want to both address some of Dr. Matthews' comments, or in particular, where you see the relationship between the United States and China going in the next period of time, and what are the challenges and how you see that evolving.
Well, first, it's an honor to be with you this evening. To be with Jessica Matthews on any forum is both daunting, but also a great honor. And Professor Schwartz, I don't know you, but I know your reputation, and it's wonderful to be with you as well. And Patrick, thank you for the invitation. I have to warn everyone in advance, my Wi-Fi is unstable for the moment, so I'm hoping to be able to stay with you. And Jessica, I hope I don't leave you alone tonight on the floor.
Well, it could happen on my end too.
I would violently agree with everything that Dr. Matthews said. Let me just add a little bit of texture as we see it from the platform I'm in. As we think about American leadership in the 21st century, we have to think about it in, I think, several different contexts. One, of course, is the relationship of the United States with the global powers that we have to come to grips with in these days. And the first and foremost of those is the one that you, Tom, rightly pointed out was China. We call that the most consequential relationship that we'll face in the first century. And I think under any circumstances and however it unfolds, it will be. But we also have a rising India. And it's unknown to us really where that path will take us. It's a great democracy, a large democracy. It's relatively technologically advanced, but like China, it has a substantial segment of its population that lives well below the poverty level and has many developing nation challenges, just as China has. But India is a democracy, and India does embrace many of the great virtues and values that we do. And so the question will become, how will India emerge in the 21st century as a democracy? Then we have a revanchist Russia. A Russia led in some respects by a kleptocracy and Vladimir Putin's intent to make Russia consequential again in the world. And that has come in the form of a remodernized Russian military with really lethal capabilities, but also an intent to follow a military doctrine in the context of hybrid warfare, if you will, that has interfered in many respects with the concepts of governance in Western Europe. Certainly in the United States in 2016 and 2018, we should expect to see that continue. And while I've always been a bit skeptical of the Russians and the Chinese being able to form a solid union, there are some, I think, inherent difficulties to that between those two peoples. It's not inconceivable that we will look back on this time 50 years from now and believe that Russia was the Chinese stalking horse for achieving its global strategic objectives. And then, of course, we have the transatlantic relationship, which we call the essential relationship of the 21st century, where we in North America, the United States and Canada, our European friends, whether it's the EU or more broadly our European friends, share a set of values that I think in many respects, as Dr. Matthews says, has defined much of the world order in the post-Cold War period, that has been unraveling for a whole variety of reasons that she very rightly stated. But then there's a new dimension to this 21st century world, and that is the emergence of technology. Technology will, in many respects, be the platform upon which global geopolitics will unfold. We call it digital authoritarianism in some respects, digital governance in some respects, but we're going to have to come to grips with that because there are entities in the world today, the mega corporations, if you will. There are entities in the world today that have actually more reach into the global population and moment-to-moment influence than do some of the sovereign states in the Westphalian tradition. So American leadership in the 20th century has to face all of those things simultaneously. That said, we also have the conundrum going on in the Middle East, and we can talk about that if you like, and the challenges that we have faced there through 2 wars, the confrontation with Iran, the issues associated with the Saudi-led coalition, the Yemen issues, and of course, Israel and its place in the region. And then finally, we have mega trends that the United States would have traditionally led in the global community in at least seeking some form of management or mitigation. These are the rapid urbanization that we see underway, where probably half the world's or more population will be in urban areas by the middle of the century. We see again the rapid rise of technology in so many forms: biotechnology, data-driven, artificially intelligent digitalization. We see changes in demography, rapid change in demography, much of it in the developing world, which makes governance even more difficult, more challenging. While the demography of the developed world ages and becomes potentially less competitive in the context of workforce. And then finally, I think extraordinarily importantly, and I get this question often from military audiences, they'll say, you know, Alan, you got a little military experience. What's the greatest threat the United States faces? And they expect me to say China or Russia or jihadist terrorists. To me, the greatest threat that the United States faces is the greatest threat that everyone faces, and that is climate change. And there are dimensions of that cut across every aspect of the human experience. In a military sense, climate change has some very real, very severe security challenges in the near future. But just look around the United States in this last calendar year. We don't have a fire season anymore. We have a fire year. The period of time of hurricanes is fraught now with both their numbers and their power and their frequency. And the central part of our country is frequently savaged by severe weather and flooding. All of this, in the end, has some relationship back to climate. So this is an extraordinarily complex moment for us, not just in the context of superpower relationships or great power relationships, but in the emergence of technologies that can either accelerate or exacerbate or magnify or improve our world existence. And then there are just mega trends that are moving along that we're going to have to deal with. And where, as the doctor said, where America led on so many of these things and helped us through transformational relationships and an emphasis on multilateralism to find our way either in the management or the mitigation of these problems. The reality is that in the world we live in now, in this Trump administration, we have ceased to lead as a global power. And these challenges now go unmet in the multilateral sense where we could conceivably address them in the past. So if anything, I hope it reinforced all that Dr. Matthews said, but what I would also then add to on the Chinese issue. In the world I live in, the world that I have sought to, and if you look behind me, there's a lot of my family's experience in Asia. I view that the Chinese relationship can occur in several different ways. There is an opportunity, I think, for us to find cooperative relationships with China. And when you think of some of the daunting problems that we face today in terms of global pandemics, regardless of how the administration seeks to articulate the latest one we're dealing with, whether it's on medical research, biotechnologies that can be enormously valuable to humankind, whether it's on issues associated with climate. There are ways that we can find cooperative relationships with the Chinese that without that relationship, some of the most daunting problems that we'll face in humankind will go unresolved in the 21st century. It's just simple as that. But we're going to have to compete with the Chinese, and we are competing with the Chinese. And some of that competition can become quite severe. You know, the whole issue associated in this administration with what the president called trade wars are easy. Well, this trade war didn't turn out to be too easy. And we have run some of the greatest trade imbalances during the so-called trade war we were going to win. And many of our farmers have been savaged by the outcome of this trade war. We haven't accomplished our objectives. But we will have to compete with the Chinese in many respects. And out of competition, we should also seek opportunity. But there is no state on the planet that has the capacity to outmatch the Chinese in a whole variety of areas. And here in competition is where there's, I think, a great opportunity for American leadership in the post-Trump era. And I think President Biden, if he becomes president, will have to embrace this reality. Here's where this global community, and I think in this case, a global community based on a consortium of our democracies, we have the opportunity to compete with China. It's not possible to contain China. No one state can. And even if it were a flawed and failed strategy on our part, the United States has so alienated so many of its partners, we would find it very difficult for them to join us in a containment strategy of China. But I think the democracy, global pooling of our capabilities that could compete with China. So we talk about cooperation, we talk about competition. This administration has found it necessary to confront China on so many things. And the Chinese deserve to be confronted on a number of levels. But from my own experience, the distance from confrontation to conflict is very short, and that slope is very slippery. And we could find ourselves in a position of being in conflict with the Chinese very quickly. So we have to manage this. And much good can come from a U.S. or a community of democracies relationship with China. But if we anticipate creating a containment strategy for China, I think that's a failing effort. So we have to manage it. We have to figure out where their technological and technology relationships will go. And I think that's going to be one of the great challenges that we face with the Chinese. I'm sorry to go on so long.
That's fine. Let me though take this and ask Dr. Matthews, where do you see the balance in dealing with a China that has very different ideas on human rights, that its behavior toward the Uyghurs, its behavior toward Hong Kong, its challenge toward Taiwan, and this point that General Allen raises of the need for cooperation on issues that cut across borders like the pandemic, like climate change as well. What, in a way, to borrow an analogy, during the Cold War, there was often this argument about whether we should deal with the Soviet Union simply on nuclear arms issues or be also concerned about human rights. Where do you see it developing with China?
I think right now, our relationship is worse than it has been in the 41 years that we have had diplomatic relations with China. In part because we have worn ideological blinders too much in our assessment of, we forget things that they do, like rescuing the world after the 2009 financial crisis, where a huge Japanese stimulus really brought the economy back, to take just one example. But we have been both cooperative. We've had both a cooperative relationship with China and we've had a conflictual one. And it's a matter of choice on the part of the two leaders, the wisdom of the US and the Chinese leader. And I couldn't agree more with General Allen's closing comment about the short distance that there is between conflict and open warfare. Right now, I think the greatest risk is in relations with Taiwan. And this is not just the Trump administration, but so-called people who style themselves as friends of Taiwan in the Congress, who are busy undermining a relationship and a treaty that has held the relationship in good stead now for several decades. It's enormously dangerous. This is not an issue that China will compromise on or will stand aside if we were to drastically change it. So I raise a red flag there. I think, what we have had in the last 3 years is a combination of sort of very erratic, fawning praise, blistering criticism, belligerence, the trade war that is largely, that has increased our bilateral trade deficit and hurt farmers and been paid for it, not by China, but by Americans, of course. And we are seeing, particularly with respect to Taiwan, this increasing danger of further rifts.
But don't you think that General Xi or President Xi has some responsibility on this as well?
No, there is no question. Chinese behavior in the South China Sea has been extremely aggressive. It has also ignored the finding of the law of the sea institution on what they are doing there. They have been pushing with very sharp elbows all around the South China Sea, and to a degree also the East China Sea as well. What the US has to do, you can't have a China policy without a policy that encompasses the rest of Asia, all of the Asian countries, but particularly Korea, Japan, Australia, India. And what we have to do is engage with them without making them choose between us and China. All of them have more trade with China than they have with us. They don't want to choose between us, but we have let our alliances go untended for the last several years, and we have done worse than that with all our allies who are democracies. So this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. It badly needs tending. And I'll just say one last word, if I could. One of the policy changes the Trump administration has adopted has been this effort to find reciprocity. If China does something to American journalists in China, then we do something to Chinese journalists in the US, and the same with students and other things. Former ambassador to Beijing, Stapleton Roy, who's probably, I think, America's greatest Chinese expert, has said that trying to follow such a policy of reciprocity, as much as it seems kind of fair, instead of making China more like us, makes us more like them. So we are going to have to really kind of start over in our Chinese policy. But I fully agree. President Xi has followed in particularly in geopolitical terms, a very aggressive policy, and at home, a repressive one. And so it's not an easy time to do this, but we have no choice.
Well, let me ask General Allen. In the Washington Post the other day, former Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz had an op-ed arguing that the United States should make a very clear commitment to Taiwan's defense, and that it should state very clearly that any attack on Taiwan would be considered that the United States defends Taiwan. And he made a comparison, of course, to the North Korean attack on South Korea in 1950, and the idea that the ambiguity in the US relationship invites aggression. I'm curious as to what you think about that argument, that we should have a very clear policy of defense on Taiwan.
Yeah, I think we've been very clear all along. In some respects, the ambiguity serves our interests. Let's make sure we're clear on the history here about the North Korea incursion into South Korea. One of the reasons the North Koreans did that was because the United States had explicitly placed South Korea outside the sphere of American influence. So it encouraged Kim Il-sung and his Soviet backers, and to some extent, ultimately the Chinese were dragged in. It encouraged them for him to attempt to consolidate control of the Korean Peninsula, because the United States, in his mind, by virtue of some very senior American pronouncements, had placed the Korean Peninsula outside the American sphere of interest and our vital interests, which means we wouldn't go to war over it. That was a massive miscalculation on their part, but also on our part. Now, the Taiwan Relations Act, which the doctor talked about, that's pretty clear that we have a relationship and we will maintain a relationship with Taiwan. But we have committed ourselves to a one China policy with the Chinese. And I want to review the policy, because the words are carefully constructed. And it is that we do not support Taiwan independence. Note that we oppose it. We say we don't support it. But we do any efforts by either side to forcibly change the status quo. Now, with that being said, we provide arms to the Taiwans. We have an annual major exercise with the Taiwans. I won't go into detail. I will tell you we've got very specific planning about supporting Taiwan. So I don't know what more we can do on this. You know, there are certainties in life, death and taxes. I think another certainty in life is if the day the Taiwans declare independence, the Chinese will go to war. And so we've got it all. We've got a Taiwan democracy that is vibrant, a real democracy. And President Tsai, the woman who leads Taiwan, has been, I think, very effective in dealing with the COVID crisis. We have a Taiwan military that is pretty good. We have been able to provide some advanced technologies to the Taiwan military. And I don't think there's any question, given our both pronouncements, our support, and our posture in the region, that a declaration of independence by the Taiwans, and we, as I said, we don't support it, it would be high risk, unprovoked invasion by Taiwan, by the Chinese. Let me just make one other point. 2 days ago, Xi Jinping was visiting in Guangdong province, which is across the water, Taiwan, and he was meeting with and talking to, in the story, they were described as elite troops, and I'll come to that in just a moment. And to Professor or Dr. Matthews' point, this idea of trading blow for blow, we had just cleared several different advanced weapon systems to be delivered to the Taiwans, which of course enrages the Chinese. And I'm not going to say one way or the other whether I think it's good or bad. It just does. It enrages the Chinese. And Xi Jinping, who is now, in essence, the perpetual president of China, whose thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics is now doctrine, it's being added into the Chinese constitution. He said to those elite troops, we must now turn our minds to preparing for war. Okay, those elite troops, the Chinese Marines, know a little about that. And they, of course, will be the lead echelon in any amphibious assault against Taiwan. So this idea of trading blows for blows, this gets us nowhere. So I don't think we could be more specific on our commitment to Taiwan as a people, Taiwan as an ally, if you will, than we are now. And I don't think we need to be more specific than that.
Okay.
No.
Do you want to add something here, Dr. Matthews? Or I was thinking.
Well, I was just going to add.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
completely I completely agree with it. It's we have these 3 communiques with the Taiwanese, and with there is brilliant nuance and ambiguity built into them that has kept the peace now for decades. It has also enabled Taiwan to become an extraordinary economic success. The per capita GDP in Taiwan is higher than it is in the UK and France, even in Japan. So they have both become a democracy, they've transitioned from authoritarian government to a democracy, and had this enormous economic success. It's hard to quarrel with the success of this policy. The Trump administration has been nibbling at it, sending high-level officials where they never did before. A lot of this is symbolic, but enormously important. And as has been said, there's not a lot of wiggle room here on the bottom line, right? Chinese are not going to play games on that bottom line, but it is, I think, unwise in the extreme to fiddle with success in a situation like that.
Granted, although in effect, what both of you are saying is that as successful as Taiwan is, we cannot allow the Taiwanese to actually have self-determination and decide for independence, or that is simply just not on the table. They should just not do it for their own purposes. But if they—
Not yet.
Yeah, well, no, I take your point, but I mean, we are saying in effect something to them about the limits on which they have to operate, both for reasons of self-preservation and certainly our own commitment. I'd like to just switch the subject a bit, though, and to another area of crisis, namely Iran. The next administration will certainly face this question of whether, if it is a Biden administration, about whether to re-enter the nuclear deal, and whether it can be simply reconstructed and revitalized. I'll start with you, General Allen, because of your background on the Middle East. Do you think we should simply re-enter it? Should it be renegotiated? What do you see in what was the one area where we had real conflict during the last 4 years, in the sense of an actual strike against the top leadership there? I'm wondering what you think should be American policy toward Iran.
Well, it's like everything else you're going to ask us tonight is pretty complex. This one is maybe a little simpler to get out. First, the Obama administration pursued, I thought, very hard for 3 years, and my number one mission was their nuclear program. So I can't go into any more detail. I know a lot about it. And the Obama administration that constrained capacity for Iran not to bring in all the rest of Iran's regional conduct, because it was believed we couldn't get it all into an agreement. And so I think properly to focus on the nuclear agreement, which the British, Germans, and the EU and the Iranians all agreed to curtail any nuclear research beyond a civil program for 10 years. That was something I don't think most people believe could be possible. And on any agreement like that, where the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans agree, that's pretty big. Okay, so the Trump administration comes in, it talks about how bad the deal is because it doesn't all the rest of Iranian conduct. And I think also because it was President Obama as well, and President Trump was pretty clear that many of Obama's initiatives just were unacceptable to him because it was Obama. And we walked away from it. We didn't just walk away from it. We savaged our European allies. We really left the Chinese and the Russians hanging out there because they had agreed with us. And of course, the Iranians, who were actually complying, and both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense warned the president they were in compliance with the agreement. the Iranians now were left out in the cold also. And we've seen behavior, bad behavior from them in a direct line approach to create difficulties and ultimately create pain because of it. Okay, so your question is, should we just try to re-enter the agreement? I don't know that it's even possible now. Just a basic term of trust. Our allies have been so badly treated by the United States over this, disparaged, threatened with sanctions, that it's not possible, in my mind, to go back to the original JCPOA. And your other question was, should we try to renegotiate it? Well, the Trump administration has sought in some manner to try to create a separate negotiation with the Iranians. They're just not having it. And so the Iranians aren't going to trust us. Our European allies, and certainly the Chinese and the Russians, are not going to expend political capital by joining an American administration against the Iranians again. I think this is going to be very difficult. I think it's going to be very difficult. Certainly a Trump administration will try. I think a Biden administration will have the credentials to want to create something new that could be constructive. And I think that there will be levels of trust there that could be reinvigorated. But the JCPOA, as we knew it before, I just don't think it's possible. And once again, trust. Away from something that was working. And when we wonder why Kim Jong-un is not interested necessarily in coming to an agreement with the United States, it's because if he had an agreement with the United States, when is he going to be ultimately certain that we won't just walk away from that one day? Mm-hmm. So we've really hurt ourselves, both with our allies and our potential opponents and enemies, in the capacity to bring people diplomatically to the table. That was, I think, a great diplomatic accomplishment. And it's not an accomplishment anymore. It's squandered, frankly. So I'll stop.
Dr. Matthews, do you think we could go back to the JCPOA, or do you agree with General Allen on this?
There's very little of it left. I mean, even at the very basic level, the deadlines for various steps, are the time has passed. Mm-hmm. I think, on the long list of things that this administration has done that I disagree with, I put this one really at the top because it was so self-defeating. As hard as it is, and I agree that I think President Trump just can't bear things that Obama did. This was probably his greatest diplomatic achievement. It was a far better treaty agreement than I think almost anybody expected we could get when the negotiations started. But it became a meme of the 2016 Republican primaries, where candidates competed with each other to say, well, I'm going to kill it on my first day in office. And then somebody else would say, well, I'm going to do it in my first hour in office. And then Trump kind of, upped the ante a bit to say it was the worst agreement ever made. And in fact, it was, as John just said, it was a tremendous achievement, built on a base of almost no mutual trust between the U.S. and Iran that has just been so frayed and with no diplomatic relations, et cetera. What it will take to try to recreate the core of it, it's going to be phenomenally difficult because the Iranians, one of the things that it did, besides having stopped this nuclear development, which has now been restarted, was it strengthened the hardliners in Iran who said, I told you so, you can't trust the Americans, right? And so there we are, right? Right back. And trust is, it's this precious commodity.
For the sake of maybe being provocative here, let me offer a counter hypothesis, namely that one of the reasons, of course, the tilt toward Iran was, of course, we alienated the Arabs in the area, many of the Arab states who are fearful of the sort of Iranian revolutionary activities that they've undertaken. And in a way, one of the results of the ripping up of the Iranian agreement may be the sort of Abraham agreements and the idea of getting the Arab countries now to recognize Israel and to create a type of alliance against Iran between Israel and the Arab states and the United States. To a certain extent, is it not possible that, in effect, what the Trump administration did was not just a personal pike against Obama, but also a different geopolitical read of the region, that aligning Israel and the Arabs was more important to the United States than reaching out to an Iranian regime, which is not, as you both have said, also engages in a lot of activities we find very problematic. General Alla, do you want to take that on? Or?
Tom, I had a instability for a second. Can you quickly restate your question? I'm sorry.
Okay, just whether one could see the Trump administration's policy, to the extent it had coherence, as being about a different geopolitical read of the region, namely to bring the Israelis and the Arabs together against Iran, required, in effect, ripping up the nuclear agreement and in effect trying to contain Iran, or at least to challenge its actions in the region, the types of actions that were left out of the nuclear agreement.
Yeah, well, if we go back and think strategic necessity for the agreement to begin with, it was in some respects, in some very real respects, about taking care of Israel. And also taking care of our allies. Remember, Iranian missiles carrying Iranian nuclear warheads can go in 360 degrees. So this wasn't just a very narrowly focused effort. It was to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of the Iranians. And I tell you that, and I know Dr. Matthews knows this from her experience, there has been long-standing cooperation between Israel and many of the Arab states on the issues of Iran. We're only just beginning to see it become formalized in many respects. And so I don't buy, and it's a very provocative question, as you say, it's the right question to ask. I don't buy that the Trump had some prescient overarching strategy that saw the brilliance of tearing up the JCPOA, creating an opportunity for Arab normalization with Iran. I don't see the connection there. Because simply tell you, as that having been the deputy commander and briefly the commander of Central Command before I went to Afghanistan, we were very closely tied in with all the Arab states with respect to the action that we would have to take against a nuclear Iran. We were very closely tied in with the Arab states. And you might not be surprised to learn, we also tied in with Israel as well. So the theory that we tore up the JCPOA in order to create, in essence, burning our ships on the beach in order to not have ability to go backwards, that's a theory I think that doesn't hold water, frankly.
Okay. Dr. Matthews, do you want to, or should we move on?
I have to agree with that. I don't think there's a trade-off there. Mm-hmm. Except to say that both the Gulf states and Israel were more comfortable with Iran in a box, in a cage, so to speak. And what frightened them, both those sets of countries, about the deal was that they could see Iran emerging again, not necessarily, as an active enemy, but as a power, as the hegemonic power in the region. Mm-hmm. But no country stays in a cage forever. Mm-hmm. And when countries are in the penalty box, that's how they behave.
Yeah.
No. So this agreement was a way out. Mm-hmm. It presaged change for the region that was uncomfortable and scary, but still unquestionably the right way to go.
Okay. Well, let me ask you at another level. We touched on it briefly. In the wake of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny and the continued activities of Russia toward the United States, is there a way forward for the United States relationship with Russia? Is there something, what should American policy toward Russia seek to accomplish? Maybe I'll ask you first, Dr. Matthews, and then go to General Allen. What do you think we should be dealing? How do you think we should be dealing with Russia?
Well, there is no quick magic quote reset, right? The first step
Yeah.
is to extend the New START treaty, which has to be done before, I think it's the third week in February. It's our last major achievement of those whole decades of arms control work done by both political parties in the United States, and it is crucial that agreement be extended. And the Russians have been asking for it. It's one of those areas where it's the right thing to do for both parties. Secondly, one of the things that has been hardest to understand about Trump policies has been about why President Trump treats President Putin the way he does. The Russians admire and respect strength, and they exploit weakness. And vis-a-vis Russia, we have been weak in the last years. And we have opened ourselves. We allowed them to do what they did in 2016. We were not prepared, but we also didn't punish, didn't shame them in the way that.
Well, had we done anything about Crimea?
Well, we have, at least with respect to the rest of Ukraine, we have a sanctions regime with the Europeans that has held for 6 years. And that's significant. It doesn't lead you to a resolution, but it's important. And I also should say that, the Trump administration agreed to ship the Ukrainians far more powerful weapons than the Obama administration had been willing to do, which I think has been the right thing to do. And so those two things said, the rest I think depends heavily on trying to restore a close relationship with our NATO allies. Because this area between Berlin and Moscow has always been, for 400 years, it's been a core foreign policy obsession of Russian rulers. That's a European issue. It's European area. And we can't, I think, develop back a stronger, more coherent, a more explicit set of policies vis-a-vis Russia without a much closer relationship, without a close relationship with our European allies.
Well,
and
would you,
to an extent,
I was going to say, would you favor being tougher on the Nord Stream pipeline, for example, with or at least saying more to Germany about the political impact of creating an agreement like that with Putin after he's poisoned one of his opponents?
Yeah, I would. It's I don't think there should be that linkage there on those two issues. But I think. Russia is a declining power. It's a weak power with a strong military and a revived military in recent years. But and as has been said by almost everybody, President Putin is a genius at playing a weak hand. He plays a weak hand very well. But it's important to remember that it is a weak hand. Right. So the kinds of policies they will pursue are those that go after weaknesses that others present them with. And I think that we faced Russia as the Soviet Union as a strong power for so long successfully, and then tried for 10 years to see if we could build on the breakup of the Soviet Union, a Europe whole and free, which failed. Not
totally,
because, not entirely because
Yeah.
of our fault, but the effort did not work. Putin chose otherwise.
Right.
And I think we have had trouble trying to define how we can be tough in the way that I think you have to be in dealing with Russia, but also recognizing the enormous power imbalance that there is now between us.
General Allen?
It's going to be a
Go.
long, slow process. I think it, as I said, there's no magic formula here. It's going to be a process of rebuilding slowly.
General Allen, I know you probably started your career with Russia being the central target. What do you think we should be? What goals should the United States have in its policy toward Russia? Have we lost General Allen? No? I'm not sure.
I think he's locked up there for just a minute, Tom.
Okay. General Allen?
Looks like he's back.
Okay.
I'm back. I'm back, Tom.
Okay.
I think the Russians pulled the plug on me.
Okay. I was going to say they're pretty good. I don't know if they've got us under observation, we're in real trouble, I guess.
Yeah.
So, what would you?
Sorry, please.
I'm just actually asking you to comment on just what should the United States policy be toward Russia?
With regard to Russia, Tom, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, yes.
Well, if you're, I hope I'm coming through.
Yeah.
You know, from my perspective, two really important things, or several actually, but two really important things is obviously to make our commitment to NATO very strong and ambiguous. You know, the president's intent to pull about 9,000 troops out of Europe, in particular, was, I think, more punitive to punish Angela Merkel than it was a great strategic move on his part that benefited one person, Vladimir Putin. An unambiguous American commitment to the NATO Charter and Article 5 is absolutely important, and it's been ambiguous. Now, secretaries of defense like Jim Mattis and Mark Esper would say, I've been very clear on that matter. But the president isn't clear on that matter, and he continues to talk about the irrelevance of NATO or the fact that it's an antique agreement and it's irrelevant now. That doesn't help our allies, and it actually emboldens the Russians and the Chinese. That's the first thing. Second thing I would Vladimir Putin recognizes that NATO defense alliance. It is not against anyone. It is for the defense of the 29 members of NATO. But what Vladimir Putin really is concerned about is the strength and the unity and the coherence of the European Union. And if you watch what has been happening in terms of the Chinese bilateralization of relations with our European partners, plus the 17+1 initiative, plus the president of the United States articulating the EU as America's #1 foe, we've got to strengthen, let's just say, a Biden administration. We've got to strengthen our relationship with the EU. We have to create the conditions under which the EU can ultimately re-emerge as a coherent organization. And of course, Brexit was a terrible blow to the EU's morale, to the EU's coherence, to the EU's narrative. We have the United States calling the EU its #1 foe, and you have Brexit underway. You have the Russians in direct assault through cyber activities from the democratic processes of the individual countries, and the Chinese creating bilateral relationships, which also work to deteriorate, if you will, the disintegration of the EU. Look, if the EU comes apart, I think that's one of the greatest victories that the Russians will have in Europe, and won't have fired a shot to do it. So those two things we have to do. One is to make unambiguous our commitment to NATO, and the other is to do what we can to treat the EU as it should be, which is a great partner with similar values, similar cultural backgrounds, similar economies. And if we can do those two things and be true to our allies and very clear in our warning to Russia that we will not tolerate the tampering of Russia in the democratic processes of our European partners, then I think that's good enough. Now, we should never give the Russians a buy on Crimea. We should never give them a buy on the Donbass. We should never give them a buy on what they have done for a genocidal dictator in Syria to his people, which they have done. Give them a buy on what they're trying to do in North Africa as well, in Libya. And we're going to have to figure out a global strategy to deal with the Russians. But if we do those things, unambiguous commitment to NATO, and do all we can to strengthen the EU as a partner, I think that's a good start.
Well, let me just though pause there, because I do think we face a challenge that the Europeans often, and especially the Germans, often have very different views of dealing with Russia than the United States and some of the other European countries. The Nord Stream pipeline being an example of that, but just this willingness to be much more sympathetic to Putin or to the Russian position on issues than the rest of Europe and the United States. So I wonder whether, in effect, we still that Russia is actually a source of disagreement as well within the alliance, and it's not just Trump in this case; it's also sort of a bipartisan aspect of this, that they do see the issues very differently than the United States.
I did a study for a Central European think tank a couple of years ago on the NATO adaptation initiatives that would need to be taken. And it was really fascinating for me. Depending on where you are in Europe, often dictates your view of Russia. So if you're in Portugal or Spain, or Italy, the view of Russia is different than if you're in Slovakia or in Croatia.
Or in Estonia or Latvia, the Baltic countries.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. No, that's exactly aggression. And the Russian aggression while there are enormous exercises that are far in excess of our agreements with the Russians, insidious activities associated with cyber in those countries as well. And they being Russia at an economic level that creates a deterioration of their view of the relationship with Brussels. So I think that there's going to be a challenge here, and what the United States has to do with Brussels is to lead a reality check on who our friends are and who they aren't. And I think, Tom, to your point, I think the Germans are actually rethinking this issue of Nord Stream. They are certainly rethinking their relationship with China as well, given all of these that we're facing. And I'm not going to be the one that says Nord Stream is good or bad, or should be stopped or not, or we're going to punish the Germans as, or that's a sovereign decision of theirs. But I will say great faith in Angela Merkel and the Russian cyber and implicit economic threats that they need to revisit the Nord Stream pipeline. We'll see where that goes.
I wanted to come to something both of you actually alluded to, and ask about this issue of that Richard Haas has raised, that foreign policy ultimately begins at home in the United States, and that the domestic basis of our foreign policy, the domestic support for our foreign policy, what do you think is necessary for American, or for the next administration to rebuild support for an engaged and active American foreign policy? What steps would you like to see? Let's hypothesize that as the polls say that Joe Biden wins. What would you like to see done to, given the fact that the election campaign has all been about domestic issues and the domestic priorities weigh most heavily on most Americans' mind, what could be done to create a more engaged view of the United States in foreign policy that could have support in the United States? Dr. Matthews?
I think the first thing is to try to talk to the American people about the importance of allies and alliances, that this is a huge part of our strength, and how much of what we do abroad flows back and forth between us and our allies, that it's not a one-way street, as people, excuse me, have been, have been hearing over the past few years. So we need, the new president needs to talk about how much of our desires, of the things we want to achieve and we want to for ourselves and for the world abroad, stem from multilateral cooperation from allies and alliances. Okay. The second thing is much trickier because it's going to take a long time. And that is that I think that the willingness to support an active and engaged foreign policy from the American people depends to a huge degree on the degree to which they feel that their needs are being met at home. And so that's not something you can repair quickly, but it's essential. And it's also essential on the other side of the coin, and that is that a huge part of the United States legitimacy abroad stems from the success of our democracy at home. We do not look like a success right now. We look like anything but. And so an important part of our power and our legitimacy to pursue the ends we want abroad comes from what others see as the success of our democracy at home. So, you can't separate both the domestic willingness to put resources into, but let me just add one also maybe seemingly vague, but it's not, factor, which is we have to invest right now money and attention and time in our diplomatic arm. It is in terrible, terrible shape. And, we have been, I would say to some degree, over-investing, certainly relatively, in our military arm for decades now, and under-investing in the State Department. And, military leaders have been the first to say this. But the last 3 years have been disastrous in the State Department. We have lost a whole generation of our very, very best, most skilled, most experienced diplomats. And and they can't be replaced. Maybe a few of them can be lured back, but we're going to have to rebuild. And both the new president has to convince Congress as well that that we cannot achieve, not just Congress, but also the American people, that we can't achieve our aims, our security, our well-being, the planet's health, without a strong, effective diplomatic arm. And it's going to be crucial for the new president to start rebuilding that with the very best people he can recruit.
In fact, your answer actually preempted a question that we had got on the chat about this. In fact, the hollowing out of the State Department. General Allen, what would you want an American president or a new administration to do in terms of creating greater domestic support for an engaged foreign policy?
Well, it's going to be difficult. We'll just assume it's a Biden administration. The Trump administration will just continue to take us down a road none of us can stand. But first, let me just echo and every fiber of my body attach myself to Dr. Matthews' comments about the State Department. You know, the greatness of America has always been in the execution of our foreign policy. And the leading edge of American foreign policy has always been our foreign service and our State Department. Now, we have enormous coercive capacity with the United States military to back up our foreign policy. But it's been our ambassadors, our young foreign service officers serving the very outer edge of American influence that have always made the difference in what has made us a truly great global power. And it is in awful and bad effects is important. Second thing is Americans, and we've seen this in polling, Americans actually do support a global role for the United States. But after you ask them that question, when you say, what does that mean? And how much are you willing to invest in it? Where should that investment go? And who should be our, that's difficult. And it's become really difficult during this administration in the last 4 years, because we have spent a lot of time with the President of the United States, backed up by a dysfunctional system of diplomatic apparatus, savaging our allies, diminishing international organizations that in so many ways, as Dr. Matthews said at the top of this gathering this evening, really helped to define American inventions of international organizations, helped to define the international organization, the international community, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, the UN Development Program, all those, they were American inventions. Yet we have systematically pulled ourselves out of many of those. We have diminished, we have criticized, we have ceased to support many of the international organizations that define the ability for the president. He's going to have to create a narrative where the United States leadership in the world is relevant. And I don't think we'll find any of our former allies in Europe or Asia who would say, we don't want it. So it's not just relevant. It is for in the world, which we have last 3 years, but return to an era when we were transformational power, where the presence of the United States in any one agreement, all of the participants in that agreement, not in a transactional way, not in a purely mathematical way, we were all greater than the sum of the parts because the United States led in that process. And our diplomatic corps was at the leading edge of that. So we've become transactional, we've become bilateral, we have eschewed our responsibilities to international organizations and multilateralism. And that has become, in essence, the mantra of this administration. So a President Biden has to completely reorient this narrative. And America being great again can't be America alone, which is where we are now. Reasserting ourselves and ultimately re-embracing our global role. And America does two great things in this world when we get busy. One is a capacity for global convening, global convergence. I was the president's envoy to the Global Coalition Against the Islamic State. Just the American request brought 65 nations together to deal with that problem. We couldn't do that today. So that kind of global relevance to convene the great powers for whatever reason it might be, a pandemic, a security problem, an economic meltdown. But the other thing about the United States, besides a global convening capacity and leadership, is global reach. And I'm not talking about the global reach of our great Air Force, which of course exists. I'm talking about the global reach of our values, the global reach of our diplomacy, the global reach of our economy. Our economy is one of the most powerful forces that's ever been unleashed on the planet. And when that economy is being wielded alongside capitalist economies of the other democracies in the 21st century, a lot can get accomplished, but with American leadership. So President Biden has to define American leadership in the 21st century as a leadership of a coalition of democracies and capitalist societies technologically advanced to do good in the world, but also, by the way, to compete with the authoritarian, compete with the illiberal states, and ultimately to deal with some of these mega trends that are coming at us like a freight train. So Americans want to be involved in the world. For the last 3.5 years, we've been pounded on the head that our allies are making us suckers. That's the term. And that multilateralism is no good because U.S., if it's great again, can do it bilaterally in a transactional way. We got to reverse that whole thing. And that's going to be perhaps much of the energy that will have to be expended by the Biden administration is just reversing that to get us back on something that looks like an even.
Well, I take your point. I'm somewhat skeptical that this campaign would provide any type of mandate to do that, since this is completely off the table in terms of a real discussion. But there is a question that was submitted for Dr. Matthews. Can you talk about the impact of nationalism and nativism around the world and the effects those issues are having on the world? This is from former Ambassador Bowers.
Well, the world's a big place. What I see more than nationalism is populism. I mean, there I see more of an international trend towards this sense of the wisdom being embodied in some inchoate the people, and that trend has spread. We certainly see some of it here in the U.S., but also really kind of globally. I don't see what has happened recently as a resurgence of nationalism so much. I mean, Europe, the most important sort of geopolitical development really of the last several decades has been the creation and solidification of the EU. Mm-hmm. And that has been a triumph over nationalism. But populism is something that we do have to worry deeply about, because it almost always leads to bad outcomes.
But wouldn't you argue, or wouldn't you see that some of the EU's problems, for example, its difficulties in dealing with Brexit and the resistance of countries like Hungary and Poland to EU edicts, so that nationalism hasn't gone away? It's still quite vibrant in a sense.
No, national feeling has not gone away. And the EU's struggle over all these decades to balance love for country and love for all the national symbols and national culture with this great regional blending. I don't underestimate the EU's weaknesses, but I think if you try to get Ohio and Vermont to agree on how to make cheese and how to make beer and how to, and the thousands and thousands of things the EU has managed to agree on, you'd find we would have a hard time doing it. The EU, I think we underestimate. We are confronted all the time with the things the EU has not yet been or not been able to do. We make a big mistake if we underestimate what it has achieved. The Iran deal was a perfect case. The EU played an essential role in that whole negotiation, representing something much bigger than the particular countries that were also represented at the table.
I have another question.
It's a mixed,
okay.
But
it's a bit. I have a question for General
nationalism
Allen.
hasn't gone away.
No. General Allen, have we lost our position? This is a question via Twitter. Have we lost our position as leader of the free world? If so, can we get it back? Should we seek to get it back? Or has the domestic climate changed to the point where it's not an imperative? And here, I would sort of mention also the article in Foreign Affairs recently by couple of scholars saying the United States should have a position at the table, but not be at the head of the table. And so that there is among some sort of an argument that perhaps, we can't go back and we have to devise a new role. How would you react to that argument? Or do you think American leadership is essential?
Well, I spend a lot of time traveling, and I spend a lot of time meeting with leaders around the world. And all for that exception, they speak with great fondness and in some respects melancholy about the fact that the United States is not leading on so many really important issues in the world. Nobody wants an American hegemon to be dictating the geostrategic realities of the world, but so much of the world yearns for a return of constructive, values-based American leadership. So whether we come to the table or not, I happen to think that if we came in and sat at the middle of the table, we'd find ourselves pretty quickly at the end of the table, at the head of the table. Not because we elbowed our way there, and not because we intimidated or coerced our way to the head of the table, but because again, the logic of American global leadership as compared to Chinese global leadership or Russian global leadership, the logic is so clear. And in an administration that places values first and seeks constructive multilateral relationships and celebrates alliances and is trustworthy, that is what is yearned for on the global stage today. We have to spend very much time overseas for countries ultimately to say, we would love to see a return of American leadership. Now, there are changes, there are realities that we have to embrace on what that leadership looks like. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the Biden administration should it be elected. But I think transformationalism, re-embracing multilateralism, re-embracing international organizations, being trustworthy, telling the truth. I think if we just do that,
okay,
better pretty quickly.
We're running out of time here, but I have a question for Doreen Miller on Long Island, who asked, if President Trump is reelected, where do you see our place in the world? I think, do you believe world leaders would turn further away? So yes, but maybe ask both of you to speculate, well, what if the polls are wrong again, and we have 4 more years of the Trump administration? Where do you see that taking us? Dr. Matthews?
I'll get to it. Let me just say one word about what we've just been talking about, if I may. This is really, this is the core of what I was trying to say an hour and a half ago when we began about reinventing what, there are a few options. One is kind of retrenchment, right? We choose to do less. We choose to define our interests more narrowly. And one is an attempt to reinvent the status quo ante. That one's not going to work, I don't think. The difficulty is trying to figure out what the middle role is that captures some of the things General Allen just said, but is more restrained than we have been in the period since the end of the Cold War. For example, for me, it would mean a much more constrained, less aggressive policy about trying to promote democracy elsewhere. That, for me, that is one area where we would want to try to change how we've been after the, so I just wanted to and the other thing that's worth saying, and I think it was implicit in what General Allen just said, is that there is no replacement for us as a global leader on the horizon. Certainly not the Chinese. It's not their ambition and it's not their capacity. The EU is too unwieldy, so who is it? There isn't anybody, but we will get in trouble, I think, if we just, and sometimes some of the things that Vice President Biden says and writes makes me nervous that there might be an attempt to do status quo ante. It won't work, I think. And on the question of what happens if President Trump is reelected, to me, it's a very dark future. It's and it's very hard even to define it because the policy has been so erratic. But I think that you can describe it as an inexplicable friendship for dictators and authoritarians, an inexplicable dislike for democratic leaders, and a misplaced reliance on sanctions and on bluster as tools of and coercion as tools of foreign policy. I think we will see more of that same.
Okay. General Allen, we're almost at the end. I'll give you the last word of the night. If a Trump is reelected, and then maybe your own thoughts.
I'm deeply worried for the future of the country, not just the world order. I think Dr. Matthews really touched well the international dimensions of it. But look, we just had the FBI roll up 2 plots to kidnap and execute at least one of 2 American governors. And why did they do that? Because they were listening to the tweets of the President of the United States that called for the liberation of those states from governors who were trying to flatten a curve that was killing thousands and thousands of people in those states. We also have a splintering of the American society along color that we had not seen before, and this could become very violent in a second Trump administration. We have walked away from the traditional role of the United States as being one of the great gatekeepers on the matters of humanity and human rights, as is evidenced, I think, by the Afghan peace treaty, where we walked away from an opportunity for us to secure the rights of women in the aftermath of this horrible sacrifice that all of us have gone through for so many years. So domestic matters that will preclude, I think, to have or see we will have to have in order to be the kind to be. So I see both, as Dr. Matthews said, international challenges, but I see enormous. We have 17,000 dead Americans, and that's because of the appalling failure of this administration to deal with this disease. The collapse of our economy and the blood, black and relevant society necessary for us to be able to stride onto the world stage and exert leadership. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, that's one way. Let me just thank both of you very much for this discussion and turn it back to Pat for a closing comment.
Thanks, Professor Schwartz, and thanks to our distinguished panel tonight. This has been an honor to be a fly on the wall here during this splendid conversation of America's place in the world. General, I hope we can get the Russians out of your internet. But I really think that this was a great conversation and will provide much for conversation among the Tennessee World Affairs Council members and all of those from around the country who have had the honor of watching the program tonight. Let me start by applauding both Brookings and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for the spectacular work that your organizations do, Dr. Matthews, under your leadership for so long, and General Allen under your leadership currently. There's not a day that my inbox is not filled with very special emails with reports and conversations and solicitations for video webinars and so forth. Yesterday, Carnegie presented a conversation about New Start, and one of the speakers was the Matthews Chair at Carnegie. And General Allen, thanks to Brookings for the support that the World Affairs Councils of America gets from Brookings. There won't be an in-person national conference this year, but the conference attendees have been always welcomed by Brookings for a think tank visit, which is much appreciated. And on behalf of the Tennessee World Affairs Council, every April when we bring our championship team for a competition called World Quest to the national title in Washington, we are always welcomed at Brookings for a special presentation by some Brookings analysts or the young students that we bring to Washington. So thanks to Brookings for that. Thanks, Professor Thomas-Schwartz, for a wonderfully moderated session. This has been terrific, and we look forward to 2 weeks from now, Ambassador Thomas Pickering and Ambassador John Kornblum. And that's it, other than to mention Professor Schwartz has a wonderful book out, Henry Kissinger and American Power, a Political Biography.
Thank you.
General Allen, you have a book as well, and your book was the monthly, we have a weekly quiz that we do at the World Affairs Council, and we offer a prize, and your book was the prize this session. If you'd like to say a brief bit about that, we'd be happy to tout that here.
Well, any
about your book.
forum or yeah, any platform that will hawk my book is a favorable platform to me. The thing we didn't talk about tonight, it would have been great, and next time we ought to, is that's the role of artificial intelligence and biotechnology in the 21st century. They may be the principal shaping influences if we're lucky, and if we're not lucky, they could be a real nightmare for us. And that's in essence what the book does. It talks about policy across the entire spectrum of the application of artificial intelligence, from education to transportation to cities to defense. And that's often the problem. We're about 7 years behind in policy lagging technological advance. Can't afford for that to lag anymore.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for that. And we look forward to getting a copy of the book here. I'm looking forward to reading that. I've already read Professor Schwartz's book on Kissinger, an excellent book. Dr. Matthews, any books or things to sell?
No.
Great. Well, thank you again. This has been a great conversation. So on behalf of the World Affairs Council, thanks to Dr. Matthews, Dr. Schwartz, and to General Allen and Semper Pfizer.